Hello, my name is Alfonso Caramazza, and I am the ERA chairholder of the ERA Chair Project, CogBooster. CogBooster is an ERA Chair action hosted by the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences of the University of Coimbra, Portugal. The aim of the project is to implement cutting-edge lines of research and scholarship in cognitive neuroscience with a strong international team of researchers to help close the gap between the psychological sciences in Portugal and in non-widening countries. The project focuses on fundamental aspects of cognition and brings a cognitive neuroscience-inspired understanding of the mind that is central to the psychological sciences. CogBooster is powered by the European Commission through the widening program of the European Research Agency and the ERA Chair actions. The project's ultimate aim is to promote an institutional reform to align the University of Coimbra and the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences with cutting-edge psychological research and education, currently available in the psychology departments within non-widening European countries and in the top psychology departments in the world. To contribute to closing this research gap and increase research quality and competitiveness at the University of Coimbra and the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at the University of Coimbra, CogBooster proposes a series of short, 1 to 2 years, medium, 3 to 5 years, and long, beyond 5 years, term objectives that are directed at different stakeholders. These are the following. Objectives directed at institutional stakeholders. Short term, to create a strong line of research in cognitive science, neuroscience, led by ERA chairholder Alfonso Caramazza, that is capable of transforming the research and educational landscape of the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at the University of Coimbra. Medium term, to bring to Portuguese academia a contemporary understanding of psychology that includes the neuroscience-informed study of the mind through better communication of results. Long term, to implement a permanent cognitive neuroscience team and reform research and education efforts at the Faculty of Psychology and Education at the University of Coimbra. Objectives directed at the users, that is the students. Short to medium term, to help consolidate a 3-cycle Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, and PhD, research-based and international program in cognitive science, neuroscience, under development at the University of Coimbra. Objectives directed at the community and policy stakeholders. Long term, to promote the move towards a new contemporary societal perspective of psychology that includes the study of the mind intimately connected to how the brain supports cognition. We are in the process of assembling a strong international team of researchers whose work focuses on major aspects of the mind, from perception to action, from language to thought. These senior and junior members will strengthen the representation of cognitive neuroscience at the university. In addition to carrying out fundamental research and teaching, we will actively contribute to disseminating the relevance and importance of cognitive neuroscience as a major contributor to the psychological sciences, both within academia and to the community at large. We will organize workshops and lecture series. One annual workshop we have already organized is on the mechanisms of seeing and acting workshop, or SAW. This year, we held the 2nd edition of the workshop. We have also started a lecture series, the MindBrain lectures, where we will invite renowned scientists who have made fundamental contributions to some aspect or other of the human mind-brain. We will also organize and be involved in several dissemination activities within the community at large. For instance, we will visit several schools in our Neuroscience Goes to School initiative, and we will be involved in major European activities to showcase our own research, such as at the European Researchers' Night. Finally, we will help develop formal educational offers in psychology and cognitive neuroscience at the university. For example, we are working on developing a master's in cognitive neuroscience degree. These developments will while promoted and funded by the ERA chair action, would not be possible without the strong support of directorship at the University of Coimbra and the board of directors of the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at the University of Coimbra. We are grateful for their strong support of the CogBooster project. Finally, I want to stress that although CogBooster is a 5-year project, the core aim is to achieve a permanent shift in how psychological sciences are thought of, both in academia as well as at the community level in Portugal. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. Allow me to start by starting to greet the Director of the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences, Professor Paula Paixão, and some of the vice directors of the Faculty of Psychology that are here also. Also, I want to greet the members of CogBooster, not only Paula, Alfonso, our shareholder, but also Oscar Gonçalves, is here too, Leonor Paes, Cláudia Cavadas, Isabel Pava Martins, Angélica Lingnau, Mel Goodale, Paul Donning, and the mic is not on. Are you not hearing me? Oh, terrible. And Zoe Cortzi. And I also want to thank, obviously, all of our colleagues, not only from the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences, University of Coimbra, but also the many people that came from other departments from the University of Coimbra and other psychology departments from Portugal. And obviously, all of you that accepted our invitation. We're here today to inaugurate the project CogBooster. And so, and what better way to do it than doing it with our other shareholder, Alfonso Caramazza. I'll tell a lot more about him later, but for now, it's obviously great to have him here. And obviously, one of the questions you might have is, what is a Project CogBooster? So Project CogBooster is a project that's funded by a funding program from the European Union, the Error Share Widening Program. And this program, as its main goal, its overarching goal, to close gaps between widening countries, that is, developing countries like Portugal, and non-widening European countries, those highly developed countries in Europe. Project CogBooster, obviously, has a similar goal. But that goal is specific to the psychological sciences. And the idea is to try and close the gap, or help close the gap, between the psychological sciences and the psychological departments within widening countries, like Portugal, and specifically the psychological science, or in this case, the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences of the University of Coimbra, and the psychological sciences and the psychological departments within non-widening countries, highly developed countries. And our idea, or a big idea to do so, is to create a strong line of research in cognitive neuroscience. Now, this project came about because we've noticed there is a gap, there is a difference, a big difference, between the way in which psychology is conceived in widening countries, and particularly in Portugal, and the way it is thought of in non-widening countries. In particular, in widening countries like Portugal, psychology is mainly thought of as an applied science. And that's fine. It's a very important aspect of psychology, but it does not exhaust psychology. Psychology is not only the intervention in or for well-being. Now, that's what happens in Portugal and most widening countries, but when we look at non-widening countries, that's not the reality. And I'm going to show you, so as I said, in Portugal, we do see psychology as an applied science, mainly, whereas outside of Portugal or outside of non-widening countries, we do not see that. We see it as psychology as a fundamental science, which with perhaps its major paradigm being cognitive science. And I just want to show you that this is not just from my head, this is really what happens when we look at the distribution of the faculty in, by area, faculty within departments of psychology by area in Portugal, where you clearly see that the majority of the faculty work within areas or have research interests within the more applied sciences and more intervention-based sciences. And that will be, so Coimbra is here. This is what happens in Coimbra, where you have a lot of people working in intervention, well-being. Again, a very important area. I'm not saying it's not. But when you look at non-widening countries, you have a major difference. You have a lot more balance between the areas. And when you look at the 5 highest ranked departments in psychology, then the difference is really massive. So we realized that this was happening. We wrote Project CogBooster, and fortunately the European Union agreed that this is something that potentially can help. If we were to be able to change this panorama, that potentially this could help with closing the gap between widening and non-widening countries in terms of psychology. And so they gave us a mandate. And the mandate is to create a strong line of research within cognitive neuroscience as a first step to close the gap, okay? Or as a first step to try and help close the gap. Now, this is just the first step. And we do have this mandate from the European Union. Fortunately, we also have the support from both our rector and the director of the Faculty of Psychology. But as I said, this is the first step. The challenge is not this. The challenge is not in hiring people that we're doing. The challenge is in the next step. And the next step is that we need to create bridges from this fundamental science to the applied science that we're doing here. That is the challenge. The challenge is to understand that perhaps there's no applied science without fundamental science, and perhaps there's no fundamental science without applied science. And that's what I want to propose to all of you here, be it students, be it faculty, be it whomever you are, is to help us create these bridges, help us build these bridges. Because if we do that, then our department, then first of all, then CogBooster will succeed in helping closing the gap, and the Faculty of Psychology will, in the University of Coimbra, Faculty of Psychology and Educational Science, University of Coimbra, will benefit tremendously from this project. So this is the challenge for the next 10 years, is to take all these graphs that I showed you, certainly balance out the different areas that we have at the Faculty of Psychology, but mainly is to create bridges. Mainly is to create an ecosystem where there's feedback between the different areas, and such that we create an ecosystem of creating knowledge, applying knowledge, creating knowledge, applying knowledge. And that is the main goal, but also the main challenge and the main pledge that I ask you to do, is to walk with us on this and help us out and create bridges with us. So, because this is not about, well, this is about Project CogBooster, but it's mainly about its area shareholder, I'm going to finish here. I think Paula is going to speak a little bit, and then I'll come back here to present the area shareholder. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I will be very brief. Dear Professor Alfonso Caramazza, CogBooster shareholder, dear Professor Jorge Almeida, Project Coordinator, dear Professor Cristina Canavarro, SINEC Scientific Coordinator, dear colleagues and students, there is a famous quote that says, "Success occurs when opportunity meets preparation," and I should add, quality and commitment to innovate. That is exactly what we are witnessing today in the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences of the University of Coimbra, as we are gathered here to carefully listen to the CogBooster Air Share inaugural lecture given by Professor Alfonso Caramazza, one of the highest-ranking researcher and top world specialists in cognitive neurosciences. Indeed, this Air Share is the result of a dedicated team effort and also of a large dose of generosity, a virtuous alignment that will certainly result in a phase shift concerning research and teaching in cognitive neurosciences at the undergraduate, master, doctoral, and postdoctoral levels at the University of Coimbra, and especially at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences. So we are very pleased and honored to welcome you, dear Professor Alfonso Caramazza, into our academic community. You now belong to it. We are eagerly expecting that your expertise and involvement will pave the way to an improved, broad, and sustainable international partnership in cognitive neuropsychology and neurosciences, one that will help set the standard for what fundamental psychological research and its interdisciplinary interfaces in Portugal should be or might be for the upcoming decade. Yours, Jorge Almeida's, Oscar Gonçalves, and ProAction team vision and projects will certainly have an impact in our research approaches and in our efforts to bring about transformative knowledge that is key to advanced science, thus reinforcing and expanding a century-long tradition in experimental psychology that was initiated at the University of Coimbra and in Portugal with the creation of the first laboratory of experimental psychology in 1912. We can hardly wait.
We're dancing here in the chairs, but this will be done in a second. I'll give it to Alfonso in a second. This project would not be here if it weren't for Alfonso as the head shareholder, as the person that will be leading us and consulting with us and helping us develop not only this strong team, but also, as I said, building the bridges and potentially helping close the gap that we have between white and non-white countries. It wouldn't be possible without him. Now, our history as friends and colleagues is long. It first became as a history of supervisor and mentor, poor Alfonso, and then it became a relationship of friends and, again, mentor. And so I'm very glad to have him here. Alfonso got his PhD in 1974 at Johns Hopkins, and in about 13 years rose to a full professor in Johns Hopkins, just 13 years. He was then hired. We then we came to Europe a couple of times, both Italy and Switzerland at a time. But in 1995, he was hired as a professor at Harvard, a place where he stayed up till now, and is still a professor at Harvard. And in the meanwhile, he created a couple of major centers of cognitive science, including he founded the Johns Hopkins Department of Cognitive Science, which is one of the best departments, I would say, currently in the US, with very, very good people. And perhaps a case in point was his work at University of Trento, the Interdepartmental Center for Brain and Mind Research. I think that would be the translation, where he created this center. I don't want to say out of nothing, but it was a center that was in a university that probably not the best university at the time in Italy. And in about 5-7 years, the GMAC was able to get 10 ERCs. not 1, not 2, 10 ERCs. We're talking about a center that had, what, 20 people, 30 people, perhaps less, as PIs, I mean. And so you can see that the number of ERCs, anyway, if I remember, I think you told me this, there were more ERCs at CIMEC than probably, I wouldn't say all Italy, but all Italy. So there were more ERCs at CIMEC than in the rest of Italy together. So that says a lot about his leadership skills, and obviously throughout his career at Harvard, he was in charge of many initiatives, including the MindBrain initiative, which is a very beautiful initiative. I had the pleasure of attending to many of the meetings when I was there, and many other aspects where Alfonso was in leadership positions within Harvard and outside Harvard. But obviously this comes also with a research career, and it's just the breadth of topics, of areas in which Alfonso has been pioneers are just many areas, probably because, and he's going to be talking about that, because he selected a particular approach to psychology and to the study of the mind that includes studying patients. And when you study patients, you study whatever nature gives you, and I think Alfonso is going to talk about that, so I'm not going to intrude too much into it. But then, because of that, you're able to touch upon many different areas, including, and perhaps in the beginning, mainly language and aphasia. A lot of important work in language, in the way we think about aphasia, in the way we think about selection of reading, writing, etc., but also selection of words, lexical selection, etc. But then there's also fantastic work in attention, spatial neglect, work more currently in object knowledge, organization of object knowledge, semantics, and also aspects related to embodiment. So whether we have abstract representations or we don't have abstract representations, whether sensory motor information is important or is not important, how important is it in the way in which we think about the world. But overall, Alfonso has been touching many different areas, and always when it does, it brings a splash. With it also came a series of prizes, and there was certainly a couple of honoris causa, doctor honoris causa, both in the Catholic University of Louvain, but also Louvain, and also at Beijing Normal University. There's a series of prizes throughout his career, and I could keep on saying many other things. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to say that it's really a great pleasure to have him here, both as now a colleague, a faculty member, well, now in a couple of days, a faculty member of the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences, which is obviously, I think, a great honor for us, but also as a friend and a colleague and a mentor. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm looking forward for your talk. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for all these kind words, both to you and to George. The only thing I'm upset about is that all these years, George was just my student, and now I have to treat him as a colleague. So it's getting me worried already. I just want to make a comment about, before I get into my talk, about the points George was making about the so-called widening and non-widening countries, and the graphic he showed about, for example, so Harvard there, and Harvard showed all of those basic scientists in psychology and a very small number of applied. psychologists, and that's terribly misleading. It's misleading because the way in which the United States has dealt with the issue is that they've created different departments, so that the bulk of people who do applied psychology is not found in departments of psychology. We do have some who teach courses in applied psychology, but that's a small percentage. We then have schools of education, we have departments of applied clinical psychology, and so on, and those are very large groups. And the reason that they're separated in the United States is largely because of the kinds of tensions that sometimes exist between the two types of work. That doesn't have to be, tension doesn't have to be there. It's there for all kinds of reasons. Some good reasons, that is resources, how they're allocated, who gets to do what. So I'm not advocating that you separate. I was just trying to point out that it's misleading to say that the widening countries have more basic researchers and applied researchers. That's not true. It is just that they work in different departments in different areas. So the applied fields are prospering, they're very strong at Harvard, but they're just not in our department. Okay, that's the thing. Thank you again for inviting me, and I'm honored. I think that that what George was saying about, one thing he was saying about me is true. I do like helping build programs. It's something that I see as a social commitment on my part, the ways in which I contribute to the field. And doing it is highly rewarding when you see especially young people who end up then being very productive researchers and very, very productive teachers. And so the opportunity to contribute to the project here is really wonderful for me. And so I'm lucky to have this opportunity, and thank you all for allowing me to do this. I'm going to, when George asked me, said that I had to give a lecture, I struggled with what I would talk about. I could give a lecture on my current research on neuroimaging or whatever. There are a number of topics I'm working on. They're really fun and exciting. But instead I chose to talk not so much on my current research in detail, but rather to talk about cognitive neuropsychology. And the reason for choosing cognitive neuropsychology is because cognitive neuropsychology is an area of research where you can see transparently the relationship between basic science and applied sciences. Cognitive neuropsychology is, in fact, at the border, if you will, between the clinical practices in neuropsychology, neurology, and basic research. My own research is in basic research, but I work with populations, clinical populations. So why a lecture on cognitive neuropsychology? Why did I choose this? Well, I've already said cognitive neuropsychology is the study of the mind-brain as revealed through the analysis of the behavior of brain-damaged individuals and other atypical cognitive systems. So cognitive neuropsychology is not just something to do, we study with patients who have brain damage as a consequence of ictus or something, but also congenital developmental disorders. So, for example, congenital prosopagnosia or various forms of dyslexia. Those populations also lend themselves to the particular kinds of studies that I'm going to talk about. And I've written a number of the things that I talk about because I know I have an accent, and I know I speak fast, and so people who are having difficulty sort of figuring my accent, perhaps they could read some of this text to make sure that you're getting what I'm saying. So I already pointed out that potential clinical value is obvious. So understanding the nature of a deficit in the hope of providing insights into strategies for rehabilitation. That is, what we do is not applied psychology. What we do is something that we hope will contribute to applied psychology, something that will create knowledge create information that could be exploited, ideally could be exploited in a clinical setting. Here I'm going to make, however, a stronger claim. I'm going to argue that cognitive neuropsychology is an indispensable tool for developing and testing theories of the functioning of the mind-brain. That is, discovering the nature of the representations and computations that characterize a cognitive process, such as recognizing an object, a scene, an event, understanding a sentence, making a decision about where to go to dinner this evening, all those kinds of cognitive machinery that is important for our everyday existence. In fact, the claim I'm going to make is that cognitive psychology is ideally placed to answer questions that are very difficult to answer with the other methodologies available to us. And I hope to convince you that I do actually have a solid argument for this claim. In some respects, it's almost arrogant that I would argue that the field I work in is or should be the queen of the sciences in the cognitive sciences. But I think that you will see that both historically as well as in current developments, cognitive neuropsychology is well positioned to help answer deep questions about mind and brain. So to begin to develop this argument, we have to first of all begin with an assumption about what the dominant paradigm is in the field of cognitive science and neuroscience. And the dominant view, the ways in which we think about the brain in neuroscience, the way we think about the mind in cognitive sciences, is as an information processing system, where a number of components together compute the different kinds of things that we are engaged in. So here is a simple example. You have an individual who's exposed to some visual scene, and the person interprets the scene and utters the sentence, "The truck is towing the bus." Could have said the bus is towed by the truck. Could have said a number of things, but in any case, they use this utterance. And what happens? Well, what happens is that there are a number of visual processes that have to be explained, have to be described. Then there's a whole bunch of interpretation of that visual scene that goes on. Then that interpretation is couched in a linguistic frame, in some kind of words in your language you speak. And then that idea, that language has to be articulated, so the motor system has to be engaged. And finally, out comes the sounds. Or look at it the other way around. So the air pressure sort of pinching sound waves or pinching on your ears, and you're forming ideas out of the sounds. It's a miracle. How does it happen? How is it that if I say car, some of you actually see a car, right? Do we have an explanation for that? What is the answer? Those of you who are scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and the answer is no. You don't have an explanation. We don't have an explanation, and in part, the bottleneck is precisely at the level of trying to determine what happens here. What is the stuff going on inside? How do we go about trying to figure out what is going on inside? Well, this is the challenge that cognitive scientists have, that cognitive neuroscientists have, and clinicians have when they're dealing with patients or individuals who have difficulties learning how to read, for example. What are the particular mechanisms that are affected? If the person were blind, we have an obvious explanation. The person cannot see the stimulus and therefore cannot read. But if the person can see perfectly well and still cannot read, what particular mechanisms are affected? How do we discover what those are? We can only do that if we have a theory of the underlying machinery. And that machinery, in the current way in which we think about it in cognitive science and neuroscience, is in terms of an information processing system. And by definition, then, an information processing system requires that we specify what the levels of representations are in that process, that we say what these kinds of things are that make it possible for me to say the truck is towing the bus. I keep on pressing the wrong button. Okay. So the challenge is that we have is the immense complexity of the process. As you can see, there's, I mean, just you guys listening and forming an idea of what I'm saying. If you think about all of the things that we have to explain to be able to make sense of what is happening, that's so immense and so complex that it's a really daunting task. But another reason that we have a big challenge is that the relative inaccessibility of the very many representations that are computed during a cognitive operation, such as reading a sentence or reading a map to decide on the best route to a destination. Okay. The stuff that is going on inside here, this stuff is not directly available to us. All we see is the input, the stimulus I give a person, we get a response, and that response doesn't tell us what the stuff inside here is. And we don't have any obvious way of studying that. There's no obvious way of going inside and looking at what it is that is going on. So we don't have direct access to those representations, and we must infer them, their properties, through indirect means. And those of you who are psychologists know what some of those methods are. I give you a stimulus, say I show you some squares and circles and so on, and I ask you to press a button as quickly as you can, whether you have a circle there, and say I show you a circle, but I'll show you some ellipses versus a circle and squares, and you're faster to say it's a circle when it's surrounded by squares than by ellipses, because ellipses are curved like circles. And then we use those kinds of observations, like reaction time, to try and make some hypothesis about what operations were going on, okay? But we don't see those things directly. What you only see is a very complex output. So is there some way to look inside? And this is the case I'm going to make from cognitive neuropsychology. So nature's contribution, occasionally highly selective damage to one or another component of a cognitive system, allows observation of the computational consequences of damage to a specific component of the overall architecture of a cognitive system, and inferences about the nature of intermediate representations within the system. So let me go back here. Well, I think I'm going to go back there. Okay. If we have if brain damage can sometimes affect some process inside the system, say around here, and by looking at the behavior when that system is damaged, whereas other components remain relatively intact, we can then try and infer what at least some of the operations must look like, what some of the representations must look like. Okay? So this is the underlying assumption. And of course, it's been very important historically. We all know that. We know about the discoveries of aphasia and certain kinds of visual disorders. And those have helped us make some hypotheses about at least what the neural structures are involved in certain kinds of cognitive systems. Now, one of the things that I think we all agree on, that methods and instruments in science are fundamental. Take, for example, the discovery of the telescope for astronomy and cosmology. We wouldn't be able to have a reasonable theory of various planets and other heavenly bodies without access to those objects. And the telescope sort of revolutionized, if you will, astronomy. Or take radiometric dating in paleontology and archaeology. So you have a finding, you find some object. Well, you don't know when it was made. So you can look at it and you can say it looks old, but how old? When did it happen? And sort of the discovery of the value of radio-14 carbon to be able to date objects was fundamental in enriching and developing a discipline like archaeology. Or take physics. Particle physics, we have all kinds of theories. Newtonian physics was fantastic. But it wasn't until the development of particle accelerators that it was possible to peek inside those particles. And the way in which it can be done is that you accelerate a particle with extreme velocities, you make it smash into another particle, and the product, the destruction of those particles creates new particles, and then you see what the stuff is that makes those particles. So what you're doing is using a process of destruction to create an insight into what is going on in matter. Now, an interesting feature of this latter example, I'll come back to the other one later, to the first one later, excuse me. Is that the technology, as I already said, involves the smashing of particles to study the new particles that are formed in the process. This could be seen as an apt analogy to the effects of brain damage on the processing components in a complex function, say recognizing a shape. I know that this analogy may sound offensive. I don't mean it to be offensive. I don't mean it to be offensive of those people who have brain damage. It's an analogy only to indicate that if we take a whole system and we break it up, we may be able to look inside once the thing is broken. Before it was a whole, we couldn't see inside. Breaking it up allows us to get a peek as to what is the underlying material. Okay? So I will explore this strategy here through one example of research in my lab, and I will conclude with a discussion of necessary constraints on its use and potential illustration. So I'm going to use one example, only one example of my research. In fact, it's not even very recent. But I chose this example because it's relatively, I think, easy to understand, I hope. Relatively easy to understand, even for those people who are not in the field. And try to show you how we can reach conclusions that we couldn't have known about from the behavior of people alone, from the ways in which neurotypical individuals behave. We couldn't have known that there was that type of representation. Okay, some examples. So let me begin, first of all, by showing you how, by looking at the neuropsychological cases, we can see all kinds of interesting things. Here's an example from, before I get into the research I'm going to talk about in detail, here's an example. A patient is shown this and is given this a sheet of paper with the word box written on it, typed in it, and then the patient is supposed to complete this sentence that describes what the patient is seeing. Okay? I love this example. I wish it to all the time. It is just amazing. Here it is. The patient said the following: the box has been negated by the misused staff. The box has been negated by the misused staff. Okay. Now, this is perhaps gibberish, you can say. There's nothing in this diagram that suggests that kind of utterance. Perhaps if you're clinically minded and perhaps psychoanalytically or whatever minded, you might try and come up with some interpretation of what the person's going through his head, of why they're reacting this way to this object. But I'm interested in something else. I'm interested in what the structure of this utterance is. Does it remind you of anything? Some of you who've taken courses in linguistics or introductory courses in psychology and linguistics and so on will immediately see that this patient is a veritable Noam Chomsky. Okay? Those of you who know Chomsky, okay, have read about his theories and so on. So this is reminiscent to me of another utterance that is also meaningless that Chomsky wrote, I think, in 1956. And the sentence was, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, that is something that is meaningless in English. Well, actually, it's not meaningless. A number of people have written poems, very clever people, and the poem then ends up with that sentence, and that way it makes sense in the context of what preceded it. But anyway, so the point is transparent, I hope, and that is that even though this patient is producing something that is meaningless in the context of this image, okay, it seems that the patient is operating as a Chomskyan. So here is Chomsky's famous sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. By the way, at one point, this sentence was the most frequent sentence in the English language. I don't know if you knew that. So it's because it was used so often in various kinds of texts. Now, I could have come up with another sentence, just like that one, weightless, heavy cities jump inconsolably. That is another meaningless sentence. But you all agree on one thing, I hope. Okay? What you agree on is that these kind of utterances are different from things like colorless, sleep ideas, green furiously. That is not a possible English sentence. And what is going on here? What is going on here is that the examples that I've given you, like colorless, green ideas, sleep furiously, and the box has been negated by the Mises stuff or whatever, that those utterances respect a structure of the English language. So these sentences that have this kind of structure, adjective, noun, phrase, okay, and then verb and adverbial phrase, if you produce English words that have those properties, it will be a possible English sentence. Okay? Now, what is this telling us? What it's telling us is that the patient I described to you is revealing a profound and important distinction. The mechanisms in our brain, in our mind, that are involved in producing sentences, language, that the syntactic structure, the syntactic operations are spared in that patient, but not the semantic lexical information. So whatever theory you're going to have of how the mind and the brain works, you're going to have to draw that distinction and structure your theory in such a way that that separation is possible. And this is what cognitive neuropsychology allows us to do. What it allows us to do is to look inside the system by looking at the kinds of breakdowns, the kinds of dissociations that can only be explained by assuming certain things about the representations that are being processed in the brain. And I'm going to give you an example in great detail in a moment. But for those of you who've never seen a patient and don't know what neuropsychology is like, I'm going to show just two very, very short movies. I don't know if this works. I hope we'll try it. Let's see. Okay, so the patient is shown this image and is asked to name it and to write the word that he's trying to say. Okay? So the patient is looking, you can see the patient is writing, and he wrote, what did he write? He wrote tiger, and the stimulus was a tiger. Right? Now he's supposed to say what the word is. He's supposed to speak the word. Long pause. He's struggling.
Look at it and tell me if that's right.
No.
He knows that that's the word that he has to say.
It's the other here.
All right.
Okay, and so he said lion. Okay. Now, I mean, it's transparent, right? It's transparent that what is going on here is that whatever theory we have of the lexicon, and we have to have a theory of the lexicon to explain how it is that we speak, that we read, those representations have to be separable in a particular way. The kind of separation has to be such that you can retrieve the semantic representation, you can retrieve one of the forms of representation, but you will not be able to retrieve its phonological or orthographic form depending on the patient. So whatever theory you have, it better be such that it remain and separate those elements. So this is how we discover then the kinds of representational distinctions that have to be incorporated in any theory of language use. Here's another example, a different type of situation. So this patient is asked to say what the thing is, the object is. The patient says scissors. Says, what do you do with them? You cut. And so he's supposed to cut, and look what is happening. Now, I don't know why they gave the patient an object that he could hurt himself with, but that's okay. Now, the person who's testing it is not exactly the right person to be doing the testing because she keeps on saying to the patient, cut it, use it to cut. The patient already said, or scissors, and he used them to cut. But she's trying to remind him, but that's not his problem, right? His problem is that he doesn't know. He doesn't know how to use that object, okay? How do I go to the next, okay? So there are some striking features that you see immediately. The perceptual processes are intact. The patient can see, the patient knows what the thing is, can access some object knowledge, including the name, knows that they're scissors, and the function they use for cutting. Patient can say that, perfectly fine, okay? But seems to have lost the ability to access manipulation knowledge. So manipulation knowledge, the knowledge we have of how we do things, is a kind of knowledge that in our brain is organized in a way that is independent only in the sense that it's dissociable from. They're not independent in the sense of being functioning together, they function together, but they're independently represented. And in this case, this type of knowledge has been damaged. So one important inference then is that object knowledge is distributed over distinct brain areas which can be damaged independently, and we can say what the kinds of functions are, what the kind of functional distinctions are. Okay. So this is what cognitive neuropsychology can do, but it can only do it in a particular way to be able to make claims about representations, and this requires very detailed investigation. So I will illustrate this with one example that I think most of you are familiar with. I'm sure everyone has heard about the disorder of neglect, visual neglect, or sometimes called hemispatial neglect. And this is a disorder that is quite remarkable. The first time I saw a patient like this, it was just mind-boggling to me. I have to just, if allow me one aside, I love what I'm doing. I love what I'm doing because it's like I'm playing games, right? I mean, you have a puzzle. A patient comes in with a particular kind of behavior, and the challenge is, can you figure out what's going on? And so imagine doing that and getting paid for it, okay? I mean, this is one of the nice things about working in cognitive neuropsychology, because you get to sort of play all day. You get to try and figure out something, and you have to come up with ways to test it, so it's very creative, right? And then when you get to actually get it to work, then it's a miracle, and you can't believe you solved it, or you think you solved it, and then you test the patient more, and then it turns out that he didn't solve it. You have to keep going, but so you get paid for playing this game all day. Now, this is important for science, basic science, but it's also important for clinical approaches. Okay? I am not a clinician. I don't have the knowledge, the skills to be able to apply this kind of knowledge I have. But the hope when you do this work is that this knowledge will be useful to someone who's smart and knows how to apply it clinically. Okay? So here is then neglect. This is, for those of you who don't know what neglect is, the patient was asked to bisect this line, this is where the patient indicated the midpoint of the line, and you can see it's not right. Okay, the midpoint is somewhere here. Okay? But if you look at it, you can see that this is probably the midline about for half of the line. So it's almost as if the patient ignored this part of the line and then correctly indicated the midpoint. That's a point I want you to think about, that what the patient is doing is correct, given an assumption about what the patient is actually aware of. So we can use then the exact nature of these kinds of behaviors to learn about the processes that are going on in bisecting. Okay? In fact, you can do this if you make this line longer, then the midpoint shifts more, right? And if you make it shorter, the midpoint gets closer to the distance. Okay? Okay, so these patients are said to have hemispatial neglect. But there are many other things that you can see in these patients that don't work, and you've perhaps seen this in textbooks. Patient is asked to draw a clock. You provide the circle, and the patient then writes. And you can see that some bizarre, seemingly bizarre things. So the patient writes all 12 numbers. Okay. Why does the patient write all 12 numbers? Well, because the patient knows that there are 12 numbers, right? But the patient is ignoring this part of the object, and so those 12 numbers have to be put somewhere, and the numbers are put here. So there's two kinds of knowledge then, must be several kinds of knowledge. So whenever we try and construct a theory of how the mind organizes knowledge about clocks or whatever, we have to keep a distinction. Okay. So here's another type of stimulus used in various tasks. The patient is supposed to copy this flower, and you see the patient sort of omits some petals and so on, or asked to copy this scene, and this particular patient copied or copied these two parts and ignored a part. So always a half, if you will, one half of the stimulus. Okay? This is another patient, same patient that I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. The patient is shown this image. He says, could you please tell me what's happening there? And the patient says, water's going out of the sink. Indeed, it is. I guess she's washing dishes. She's making a real mess. I think that's it. Now, what you notice right away is that the patient completely ignores half of the image. The patient is describing only what happens on this side of the image. Now, this cannot be just this, if you think about it, not a problem to an internal representation, because the patient should be able to move his head and his eyes, right? And the patient can move the eyes. Now, of course, patients with severe neglect have difficulties that tend to sort of keep the eyes pointing to the right. But in general, as they get a little bit better, they can move their eyes. And yet, as you can see, the patient is ignoring. So the ignoring is happening not on the page. The ignoring is happening in their head. And if it's happening in their heads, then the question is, where is it happening? Okay, so here then, but it turns out there are different types of patients with neglect, and here are two patients that I study with R.G. Hillis and Laveno Subaya. So this is the patient I showed you before, MR, who neglects half of the scene, versus patient NG, who ignores half of an object, half of each object in a scene. This patient had right hemisphere damage, so left hemisphere damage, so the patient is ignoring the right. This patient left hemisphere damage, right hemisphere damage, and is ignoring the left. Okay? But you can see that these are fundamentally distinct kinds of problems. One is ignoring a whole scene, and one is ignoring each object separately, individually. Okay, if you then ask the same patients to perform the task, you say, could you please cross out all the little lines out there on the paper? One patient, this patient, crosses out all these lines and ignores these, okay, because they're ignoring half of a scene, and this patient ignores half of each block of objects. So this is an object-based type of disorder, and this is a scene type of disorder. Okay, now the rest of the talk is going to be looking at reading, because reading is something that we can manipulate very nicely, and we can actually learn something about the structure of the reading process and attention. So this is the focus will be primarily on patient NG, and these are some examples of some of the errors. Is stuff legible? Yeah, thank you. So patient has to read humid, says human. Has to read sprinter, says sprinkle. Though, says thoughts. Hound, house, dump. And you can see the way the patient gets right the left parts of the word, and then makes errors on the right part. The other thing you will notice is that the response is roughly the same length as the stimulus. Okay. Why roughly the same length? Well, because the patient knows that word is that long. Knows in some sense that is not implicit knowledge, is not aware knowledge. The patient knows how long the line is when it's bisecting to be able to bisect it always on half of the half of the line, right? So the only way that the patient could, so imagine the patient is bisecting a line that's this long versus a line that is this long, and if you look at the bisection, this one is a certain percentage from the center, half of this line, and when it's longer, as you say, half of this. So the patient has processed the line. The visual system has seen the whole line. It's a later cognitive process that the patient is impaired at. Okay? So now we can localize the level of the representation affected within the cognitive system. And it's outside of the stuff out there, it's what's happening inside. And the same thing with words. Okay? So the remarkable thing about this patient, however, is that this is the performance in reading horizontally displayed words, regular words. So the patient makes errors here, 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 and you can see the errors increase as you move away from the center. More errors as you get further away from the center, and no errors on the left for regular reading. If you now give the patient a word written vertically, what should happen? Now, those of you who are clinicians, some of you may not have seen patients like this, might say, oh, he should be fine. Well, this patient is not fine. This patient makes errors just like as if the word were organized horizontally. So rigid is read as right, and rang is read as ran. And even when you present the words in mirror reverse form, so common, C-O-M-M-O-N, the patient makes errors at the end of the word, irrespective of how the information is given visually. Okay? I hope you're getting excited. What this is saying is, and if you're not, you should. What this is saying is that we are tapping into a level of representation in the patient's brain that is organized in a way that respects the left to right orientation of words in a language like English. If we're doing it in Hebrew or Arabic, it would be the other way around, from right to left. But for speakers of English, it is in Italian, French, and so on, and Portuguese, it is from left to right, and the neglect is happening at that internal level. So if you look at regular reading, vertical reading, you can have naming of orally spelled word. If you tell the patient, R-I-G-H-T, what does it spell? R-I-G-I-D, what does it spell? The patient might say right, might say ribbon, might say something. So even when we give the word orally, that is when we give the sounds of the letters, the patient hears all the letters, nonetheless, the patient makes errors in reading the right part of the word. Now, what that tells you again is that people who learn how to read and you spell the words to them, and you do this in languages that have ugly orthography like English. Have you noticed how ugly orthography is in English? Sorry, I see it. Okay. It doesn't make sense. It's not like Italian. In Italian, everything is perfectly transparent. You have letters and you have sounds, and then you can pronounce the word. In English, you have words like Y-A-C-H-T. Can you spell that? Can you pronounce that? Y-A-C-H-T. It's yacht. But they say yacht. How did they get yacht, right? If you think about it, it's a bit bizarre. But in any case, in this case, what it says is that if you tell a patient Y-A-C-H-T, okay, the patient is going to have to access a word that has Y-A-C in the beginning to pronounce it. And so this is happening whether I give you the word in written form or whether I spell you the letters. So I hope you're getting excited even more, because now we're really converging on where we must be in the system that the problem is. Okay, so this is, if you look at the errors, you can see the errors are always on the right side, and the increases of distance from the center for all different kinds of of way of presenting the word. And these are examples, many examples that you can look at. Excuse me. So in mirror reversed, in reading crime, these are known words. Greenish says greenery, basis says bass. So okay, the errors are always on the right end of the word. Okay. Now, another thing you want to steer the way is, just like we said for line bisection, if you now organize the words in terms of their length, so here are the 4-letter words, 5-letter words, 6, and so on. What you can see is that the errors are occurring on the right half of the word. Okay? So it's not that the patient cannot read the letters at the end of the word. The patient can read many words. So if you go to let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 positions in a 9-letter word, the patient doesn't make any errors. If you go to a 4-letter word, the patient makes errors. for this third and fourth position. Okay? So it's the half of the word that is being affected, irrespective of how long it is. Okay? And this is true for vertical reading, for mirror reverse reading, for recognition of orally spelled words, like when I spell the words to you. All of them have the same characteristic. Okay? So now we have reached I'm only reporting a small amount of the data because then you can use this kind of case to study other aspects about the representation. I only want to make one point to illustrate this. Okay, so this is now, if I give you a word written like common, the patient makes no errors at the beginning, makes lots of errors at the end. The patient is given a vertically written word, the patient makes errors for the first letters here, and the errors decrease, so the top letters are spared, the bottom letters are damaged. I give it to you in mirror reverse. Now I get the opposite pattern. The patient gets the words at the end, on the right of the stimulus. What happened? Did I? The patient gets correctly the words on the right of the stimulus, but on the left of the word. Okay, do you see that? We have dissociated now right-left in terms of the external representation versus the internal representation. Okay? So if you organize all this performance, not in terms of their spatial location in space, but their location within an abstract word representation that has the graphemes C, O, M, M, O, N, for example, you can see that they're perfectly aligned. So the performance is equivalent across these cases if you consider the internal representation that the patient is operating with. Okay. Interestingly, I want to go a bit faster through this because I want to I'll be happy to answer questions if there are questions afterwards. The same thing happens when the patient is asked to write. So you ask the patient to write. Now notice that the operation that is engaged here is that I have to generate an internal representation, and then I have to write. I have to output that representation. And in this patient, the patient makes spelling errors, writing errors, just like they make in reading. Okay, is this clear? So this is the patient asked to write 4-letter words, 5-letter words, 6, and so on. You can see the patient makes no errors for the beginning of the word, but makes errors at the end of the word. And this is true both for, and this can be seen again when we sort of center the word, and the errors are always occurring on the right end of the word, not on the left part, not at the end of the word, not the beginning. Okay, and for those of you who want to see numbers, as you can see, it's perfectly clear that in all of these tasks, regular reading, vertical reading, naming of orally spelled words, mirror reverse reading, written spelling, oral spelling, backward spelling, delayed copying. Can you guys do delayed backward spelling? I'm Italian, so I'm ungifted when it comes to spelling because I never had to learn to spell when I was learning how to read Italian. But American children learn to spell. And it's an amazing skill to have. You ask them to spell, well, they give you all the letters. For me, I have to sort of think about it. Okay. You can ask them to spell backwards. So if you give a person the word right, okay, could you spell it backwards from the end of the word? Okay. For me, it's a struggle. I have to sit there. Right, R-I-G-H-T, T-H-H. Okay, then T. I have to do a very complex operation. For them, it's something to do very quickly. And so this patient, she was amazing. And in backward spelling, I mean, she was perfect, as you can see. She made errors only at the end of the word, but not at the beginning of the word. So in all of these tasks, the patient's performance is the same. Okay? So what can we conclude? And I'm almost done with the research part. So there are a number of things that we have documented here. So reading impairment took the same form irrespective of topographic transformations. Okay? So this means that the problem that the patient has is not one of processing information in terms of the orientation of the word in space. It doesn't matter how you orient a word in space. Okay. That representation is not, that manipulation is not contributing to the impairment. So the deficit involves a level of processing where graphemic, form-independent information is represented in an orientation invariant canonical form. Okay, so we have to assume that there's a canonical form in the brain at some point that says the word right is R-I-G-H-T, irrespective of how I show it to you. Okay? So that's, I hope you're impressed, right? I mean, what it is saying is this patient is telling us, look, guys, attention, this mechanism of attention that we talk so much about, can be directed at an internal representation. And this internal representation has to have certain kinds of properties. In the case of words, it has to be organized from left to right, because the damage is in the left hemisphere, so the right part is being neglected, and so there must be an internal representation that has those properties. The fact that the spelling deficit took the same form irrespective of whether a written or oral response was required, this allows us to rule out some other hypotheses, and that the performance remained invariant regardless of the order of output, rules out the deficit to a serial order processing mechanism, as well as a deficit to premotor mechanism. So many people thought, well, perhaps the ways in which things happen is that what we're doing is we're trying to create a sequence, a temporal sequence perhaps, that we're going to try and process information through, and the answer, that's not the right answer. At least perhaps we can do that, but that's not what explains the patient's behavior. The fact that reading performance remained invariant for normal, vertical, and mirror-reversed words, and that reading and spelling performance were qualitatively identical, suggests that reading and spelling involve computing a spatially coded, abstract orthographic representation in a word-centered coordinate system. Okay? So this is the conclusion. Okay? The conclusion is that when we learn how to read, when we read, we have a level of representation that has these precise properties. Now, of course, this could all be wrong. This could be a Martian in our midst. I'm not saying that there may not be problems. We can discuss that. But at least from these kinds of data, we can make a claim about the particle. Okay? And if you look at the proton, you exploded. The particles that make up the particle proton, we can see what those are. So when I look at the proton, I don't see what's inside. I have to explode it to see inside. And the same thing here. When I look at people reading, I don't know that there's that kind of representation. I have to break it apart to be able to look inside. So here's the hypothesis. We have an input representation of some sort. Some information is shown here. It's this kind of information. So there's this level of processing. For those of you who are interested in more specific details, this is what we call retinocentric feature map, where just the visual information is being projected. Then there's a stimulus-centered letter-shaped map, a map of the word, of the stimulus itself. Okay? But that's not what is how we read. How we read is that we then transform this into a word-centered grapheme description. And this is where we then make contact with meaning, what the word means, this representation. So we have to assume that there is this representation. Now, some of you may be interested in reading and work in reading. Did you know that this was a requirement for how we read, okay, the process of people in vision, okay? I mean, this is something that is required to account for this pattern of performance. Okay? So we are actually then analyzing an internal representation that is not directly accessible to us by studying the behavior of a reading performance. Okay? Because when we study the behavior, normal behavior, we don't get to see that intermediate process. All we hear is the sound, the meaning. Okay. So, I'm almost done. Have I spent? I'm on time, right? I'm not too late. So let's return to methods and instruments in science, okay? I've explored the analogy between the role of particle accelerators in nuclear physics and brain damage in cognitive science, neuroscience. And I think that it's just perhaps an attempt to make ourselves sound important. We're just like nuclear physicists. You know, we also have particle accelerators. There happen to be nature that does it, but she does a pretty good job accelerating the particles and showing us what the internal structure is. The analogy is apt, though, because what we're trying to show is that it's the breakdown process itself, that you have to open up the stuff to be able to see inside. Okay? So we've seen how the representation wood-centered grapheme description, which was not directly accessible to us prior to the investigation of the impaired cognitive system in NG, was revealed by exploding a component of the neurotypical visual word processing system. So that's the analogy that I think is important. Okay? But there's another aspect that I mentioned at the beginning. I mentioned two kinds of sciences. I mentioned sciences like physics, and I mentioned sciences like paleontology and archaeology. And this is where the issue becomes interesting in a different sense. CN also shares similarities with the sciences of archaeology and paleontology. The relevant dimension here is that unlike nuclear physics, these disciplines depend on findings and not on controlled experiments. A paleontologist doesn't have an experiment in mind. So I'm going to do an experiment tomorrow. On what? For what? What are you going to do? No, she goes to the field and picks up a finding, something. That thing is a product that is given to the scientist, just like brain damage is given to the neuropsychologist. Okay? So we do not control the initial inputs. And the research that we engage in says not that paleontologists are not smart. They cannot do experiments. They can do all kinds of amazing things with an object once they get it. Right? But they cannot create the experiment. The experiment is created by nature. In this case, it is a finding, something that is provided. So investigations of brain damaged individuals are similarly structured. They are the result of findings, of experiments of nature. This has important methodological consequences. The nature of the damage to a cognitive system is not directly known to us, but must be inferred from the behavior of such individuals. So when we see a patient and we study the patient, we are doing two things. We have to localize the damage in the cognitive system and describe and see what the properties of the consequences of that localized impairment in a cognitive system. This requires detailed and extensive investigations to identify the type of experiment nature has produced and testing the implications of the experiment. You cannot be a clinician and do this kind of work. When you're a clinician, you see the patient, and you have just a little time to be able to do and help come up with some program. You cannot spend 6 months like we did, or a year, to try and figure out what is going on. Okay? That is the job that we give to some other people in our society. To say, okay, your job is go ahead and try and figure out as much as you can, okay? And provide as much knowledge as you can. And it's a partnership. Once we have that knowledge, then it can be distilled. The next time I see a patient, I can make the test very quickly and say, okay, perhaps this patient is more like the kind of description we have here. So this is why there shouldn't be an invidious kind of relationship between the clinical and the basic sciences. However, I want to conclude by discussing some of the limitations of this approach. I think this approach is the most beautiful approach, as I said, because it is you get up in the morning and you go to the lab and you sit and then think, okay, so what's the next task I have to do? How do I get to figure out what is going on? I was speaking yesterday with 2 young people here, and they were showing me all of the data, and all I did was sort of raise problems for them. Say, yeah, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you conclude? I mean, that's the kind of thing you can do, and it's really fun, but it's hard work. So there are some political and practice issues in science, okay? So cognitive psychology depends on experiments of nature, makes access to the right experiment, uncertain and difficult. So when the patient comes in, I don't know if the patient is going to have so much damage that it's not interpretable. Now, this is not something that we can control. So take archaeology. If you find some artifact, something that is broken, and the pieces are of a size that can be used to reconstruct a whole, then you have a good finding. But if, for whatever reason, that particular object was broken up in such tiny, tiny pieces that even though we can see that it may be an artifact of some sort, we cannot reconstruct it, well, what can we do? Not much. Okay? And the same thing in neuropsychology. If a brain damage is too extensive, is too large, over many, many dimensions, it's going to be very hard to try and pull out what is going on. Okay? So as researchers, we depend on the good graces of nature to give us the right kind of cases. And she doesn't always like us. And so she doesn't sometimes give us things. She liked my group. I had amazing collaborators. She didn't like me, but she liked my collaborators. And we got all kinds of amazing patients. This is particularly acute problem for using this method in educational context. If you're a graduate student, you cannot say, I'm going to start studying this, because you have to have a finding. Just like archaeologists or paleontologists. You have to have a finding before you can study it. And so it's very hard to try and do science, cognitive psychology in an educational setting unless some other conditions obtain. Okay? The other thing is getting funding. You cannot propose, I'm going to study a patient like the one I just described, because I don't know if I'm going to find one, right? And so what kind of proposal do you make to NIH? I had funding from NIH until 2008, 2000. Every year I had 2 or 3 grants. And then in 2005, the director of NIH said, we will not find any longer case studies. So they stopped funding that. Now it's a kind of stupid thing to do, but it sort of decimated a particular approach to cognitive psychology. So the only people who do it are people in clinical settings, but they don't have sometimes the training or they don't have the time to be able to do it, and so there's a real terrible consequence. There's another problem, and that's the confusion about the appropriate method for the study of experiments of nature and single-patient methodology versus syndrome-based research. I'm not going to go there, but if anyone is interested in this question, I've argued, and people don't like me for that syndrome-based research cannot result in meaningful interpretation of results. Okay? And I'd be happy to discuss that anyone who's interested in this topic. So there is one possibility, and that could be an amazingly good outcome, and that would be the creation of consortia. So if you have now a number of hospitals in this area, and a number of hospitals perhaps down in Porto, and then perhaps down in Madrid even, and so on, that you team up and say, okay guys, let's all look for patients who have reading difficulties, and let's see, if you have a patient, then we can team up to try and, okay. That could be a way to do it, but this requires perhaps much more collaboration than many scientists are willing to engage in, which is terrible. But consortia would be one solution. For all these problems, even these problems, cognitive neuropsychology remains an indispensable component of cognitive science and neuroscience if you're truly committed to uncovering the many levels of representation that define a cognitive system. Now, I hope you agree with me, because if you ask yourself, those of you who do cognitive psychology, perception, and so on, if you know with any degree of certainty, meaning that you have good empirical evidence for it, what the intermediate level of representations are in the thing you study, okay? If you know, put up your hand. None of you. Okay. There are no hands up. And that's because we cannot do that. All we can do is generate some hypotheses and then look at the input-output relationship and make some guesses about what is going on. Okay? But we cannot have direct evidence about those levels. Cognitive psychology does that. So thank you all. Thank you for putting up with my diatribe. And I've been amazingly fortunate over the years in having some amazing collaborators. I'm just listing a few of the ones who were most directly involved in some of the current things I'm working on. But the ones who were most involved in my neuropsychological work were R.G. Hillis, Brenda Rapp, Gabriele Micheli, Ilabeno Subaya, currently Sedak Bik. These are Jenny Shelton and the other collaborators on related problems, but not directly in cognitive psychology. And thank you all, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alfonso. I don't know if anyone has questions. There's one question here in the front. Wait, if you wait for the microphone, otherwise.
Thank you for the talk. So a couple of questions. First, look, do you have any data that would suggest whether people are processing, with neglect, they're processing the words letter by letter, or whether they're working on a morphological level? Imagine you have the word like reworked. Will they consider re and ed as a single unit or as letter by letter, two different units?
Right. So, yeah, thank you for that question. We spent a lot of time working on that problem, both in terms of prefixing and suffixing, primarily because if the neglect is on one side, we wanted to see how the information is processed. The answer is that the input is that to know that you have as a prefix, re-x is if you have the whole word. Okay, and so it looked like, for the most part, the patient were treating the initial letters as the beginning of a potential word. If the prefixed word, the re-x, is something that is common, okay, then the subject used that information. If it was infrequent, because we can use re almost for anything, then and there was a word that was not prefixed with re, then the patient would use that information. But yes, the patient was aware of the morphological structure. Another way of saying this is that if we gave the patient a word, say whatever, jumping, and instead of having ing at the end, we had jump xxxxx, okay? Then the patient produced a very different kind of response. The patient could use subtle information about violations of English orthography to define what the borders of the word should be.
So basically, the conclusion is they're bringing in their calculation information about the frequency of the morpheme.
No,
well, I didn't understand.
No, what I'm saying is that what I'm saying is that how do we access a word? So you have a word in your brain, in your head. How do you access that word? How do you come about? The way in which our theory and other people's theory says is that we actually have a match between a string, an input string, and internal representation. We claim the internal representation is the properties we described. So at that point, you have to match it. Now, the frequency of that representation helps determine which response I want to give. If I have multiple words that have the same beginning, but of different frequencies, the patient will choose, the response will be the higher frequency. And that's because the activation level of the representation is sufficiently high to begin with, that in any initial input will make it go over threshold. So actually, we spend a lot of time actually making those kinds of arguments, and so we have evidence about how the lexical decision is made, essentially.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And a smaller question. Why do we see, if I'm right, all the patients having problems on one side? Is there kind
It's only one patient, not all the patients. This one. Okay, that's the thing. The only way you can do this work is if you do hundreds of experiments. I'll send you, if anyone interested, a paper we just published a few months ago, and in the paper we report 100 experiments. To be able to actually converge on an interpretation that you can defend, you have to test many different aspects. These are all single patient analyses. A single patient who studied, in some cases, for years until we are confident that we've understood exactly what. If the evidence converges on an explanation, we publish it. If it doesn't converge, we put up our hands and say, we don't understand what's going on. Okay, it's just like we do when you do experiments in the lab, right? You do an experiment, but then you want to test it because it generates a particular hypothesis. You test it, and if it converges, you say, okay, it looks I'm on the right track. Yeah, but I didn't test for that. Make another change. You make that change. So it's the same process. There's no miracle, no strange thing happening here. It's all the same kinds of reasoning. The difference is that we don't control the input, and so we don't know what to expect.
Then the question is how generalizable your results from one subject to the population are. Maybe if I have a neglect on a different side, you will have very different result pattern on me than on that subject,
You will have-
back on this side.
Yes, if you have a lesion on the other side, the pattern will be different, but the conclusions will be the same. That is, the hypothesis that the internal representations will be the same. The behavior will be different in terms of where it occurs, but the principles of the behavior should be the same. Or a theory is wrong. Okay? So you generate hypotheses, you test it as much as you can with the patient, and then you also, okay, so this is the thing that is sometimes not fully appreciated. When I publish a paper, I'm supposed to explain my result in the context of existing body of evidence already about the thing I'm testing. If I have a result that is in conflict with existing interpretations, then I have to articulate an alternative hypothesis that explains my results as well as the ones that previously was explained by different hypotheses. It's the same thing here. I cannot publish a patient here unless I have evidence that says that this hypothesis we generated is incompatible with other existing evidence. So there's no, again, the methods of science should be the same, irrespective. That's why I used physics, I used archaeology and so on, because the reasoning is identical. Okay? The reasoning is always identical. The question is what kind of thing, hypothesis is defensible given the existing evidence as well as your evidence. If your evidence doesn't fit the existing accounts, then you have a choice. There's something wrong with your research, you can look and see what went wrong, or you can say, that theory is wrong. That theory is wrong. But then it's incumbent on you to explain not just your result, but the results that the other theory explained. Okay? And that's exactly what this applies. That's why this approach is hard. Okay? It's hard because you're stuck to having to find something that nature gives you, and then you have to work at it until you're able to come up with a coherent account. On the other hand, you're getting paid for that. Just think of how much fun it is. Okay.
Are there any other questions? No.
Well, thank you so much, Alfonso. Very, very interesting presentation. You made really a very good point for the contributions of cognitive neuropsychology to a science-based practice. But I would like to ask you if you have any insights, if we want to move a little bit further from the clinical point of view. And for instance, one of the puzzles that we have with ME neglect patients is anosognosia, contrary to ME anorexia. What it is for the patient to experience the ME neglect. And this is the kind of question that I believe cognitive neuropsychology has been avoiding in terms of experimental research. Any insights, any suggestions on that?
Thank you for that question, Oscar. It's a beautiful question. Did you know who Eduardo Bisiak is? Was Eduardo Bisiak? Eduardo Bisiak was one of my heroes. He is the one who did experiments on the Piazza del Duomo. That is where he showed that patients with neglect neglected also in their imagery of things, okay? And now, it turns out that if you're interested in the history of this, Ennio de Renzi already had made an important discovery because he had shown that the patients showed the same neglect when they were doing tasks where they couldn't see and they were using their hands. Okay? So similar kinds of notion that there's an internal representation of which you're operating and not the visual thing. The answer is no. It is one of the most, if any of you have seen these patients, it is one of the most difficult things to come to grips with. The patient behaves as if a part of the world is not there. Okay? At the same time, the thing that I've always sort of tell myself is, why is it that if you show them a picture of a face, they say, oh, I didn't show you, we have experiments where we give chimeras, we make objects that are made up of two different things so that the object that's not a real object, the patient behaves as if only the one side is there. The one whole side. If a patient sees a person or an image, why doesn't the patient start screaming, oh my God, there's not a person there? Why didn't they say that? right? They don't say, this is for person day. So there must be some completion. Okay? The question is, what is that completion like? What is the mechanism of completion? And I wish I could study that. I mean, that would be the kind of thing that if any of you have good neglect patients, sort of good, I mean patients who are stable, and so you can, okay, I'd love to study it. Okay. It is clear that the patient must be completing that representation. Okay. Two things are clear. One, the patient has processed the stimulus at the visual level, all level. Okay, we know that because of the line bisection, they bisect increasingly to the right as you make the line longer. Okay, so that you must have processed all of the information. Okay. But then how you complete it is not clear. Now the way in which the patient completes it, in our case, is that we say there exist lexical items that have this property, and they can activate that lexical entry that matches that part. Okay? And so even though they're not aware of this, they can still access something. When they see a person, if they know the person, their assumption is that they will see the person in the way they were. But if I go to the patient and I shave half of my face, okay, the theory would be if I shave one half of the face on the side, the rectal side, the patient should be perfectly happy. If I shave the good side, oh, you shaved. Okay, but the person sees me, perhaps, the hypothesis, as I am. It's the way that I am as a whole person. And so that the completion that takes place is the symmetry kind of mechanism that says, I will simply flip this part over and I will complete it that way. That's the only way I can explain it. Otherwise, you'd think that it's madness, right? It's madness. How can the patient not scream that there is something wrong, right? So they must be completing it. But how they complete it, that is a profound mistake. Why did I bring up Eduardo Bisiak? Because he spent years of his life. He couldn't sleep. That was the obsession he had, was trying to figure out what it was. And he never succeeded. And if he didn't succeed, I don't know who will succeed. I mean, he was so much into it that he used so much of the literature that you would think that he would have some good ideas. He didn't have any. And he always told me, I mean, he said that, yeah, I have no idea. I just don't know. But that would be an important thing to certainly to try and study.
There's a question there, Idem.
Have I converted anyone to neuropsychology? Okay, it's cheap.
Thank you for your talk. So I was wondering, like, whether this neglect is actually happening for other sensory systems, like, for example, proprioception, because, like, I felt like, especially if I was a patient, I guess, like, that would be the most difficult part, like when I'm trying to wear my clothes, you know, like, or do something like make coffee or something, because if I'm also neglecting half of my body somehow, I guess that would be more difficult. So I was wondering about, like, how specific this is.
Right. It turns out to affect part of the body too. Okay. So and there are all kinds of strange disorders also, which I haven't had the chance to study. And I had one. I'm the wrong person to ask these kinds of questions, because I worked in this sort of sheltered environment, in this ivory tower. I was at the ivory tower, and so I never really got to see those kinds of patients. But they do have. You can show that they ignore. I mean, if you touch, say, the hand, they ignore the part on the neglected side. Okay, so there are all kinds of tests to show that this is not only a visual problem. Okay. Why is it studied in vision? Because it is so obvious, right? It is something that, but there are people who study also those other systems. But you have behind you a clinician who probably can give you a better answer than this. I'm not the right person to ask any interesting question about the patients. Not because I'm not interested, but because I didn't have the opportunity to do that. So just to give an idea, which is both good and bad, and George is a witness here. I mean, if you present anything in my lab, you're bombarded immediately by criticisms of what you're presenting and so on. And so I would spend all of my time with my collaborators sort of with a very long whip. Wow! Say, did you do that? Did you change that? But I never really got the opportunity to see the patients.
We were the patients.
And I always told myself as I got a little bit older and I didn't have such a big lab and something that I would spend more time learning those things. So perhaps I'll do it here in Coimbra, if the clinicians here help me and allow me. We'll do that. Yeah. But yeah, it's a good question. It's not restricted to vision. The other thing is that I mean, there are these descriptions I read about. I don't know, I've never seen them. There's the description of a patient eating, and the patient eats the food on half of the plate and stops. Okay, and the nurse comes. He comes and he flips the plate. And the patient continues eating. Okay. And if you try and think about it, you can see that we really don't understand how the mind works, right? Okay, the patient is moving his head or her head and it's moving his arm, so you'd think that they would hit that information. No, because the neglect is in an internal representation, and that's why I was trying to convince you that the only way we're going to understand how the mind works is we construct theories of these internal representations. And these kinds of demonstrations, the patient eats half of the plate and then, unless you flip it, it will stop. That tells you that there's something wrong about the ways in which you think about attention. So what is attention? Right? So we have all kinds of theories of attention. I didn't go into that, but we could discuss about what modifications we have to make to a theory of attention. Just give you one anecdote. We have a patient who's been studied by one of my graduate students, current graduate students, Sedak Beek, an amazing young woman. And the patient shows neglect. Okay, so you give the patient a chimera. A chimera is a stimulus made up of half of two different objects. Okay, so you say half a person and an umbrella. You know, anything, any crazy thing. And the patient looks and says, "Oh, there's a person there," or whatever, depending on what the neglect is. Okay, is there anything wrong with there? No, nothing wrong. It's fine. Okay. You do all kinds of tests, okay? And then the patient says, well, you know, I don't know what, yeah, it looks like a normal, whatever, a car, and it's a car dog. So what you do is you take half a car, half a dog, you stick them together, and you show the patient reports only one side, okay? And then says, yeah, it's perfectly fine, but it's red, partly red. Wait a minute, what do you mean red? If you just ignore that side, why are you reporting red? And it was red. And in fact, if you make the stimulus half red and half whatever, sort of even a contour, or the letters, you give the word written in red in one part and blue in the other, the patient reads the stimulus as if only the right part was there, okay, ignores the left part, but can tell you that the word is red and blue. Okay? Now that is impossible on current theories of attention. Okay? A current theory of attention says that attention is fundamental for binding. That is, I know that something is, say, a white, whatever this thing is, because I can bind the color and the shape and so on into this entity. It looks like it is possible in neglect to have the independent components emerge. And he can do that for color, he can do that for location in space within the object, and for orientation, but not for shape. Okay? So I cannot tell you if it's a square or a circle inside this object, but can tell you that it's red, can tell you if it's a rectangle that is oriented sort of from sort of bottom up to the left, can tell you all of those things. Okay? Now, we don't have a good explanation yet. We're still working with this case. But what it's saying is that our awareness, what we become aware of, may depend or may involve different levels of representation. So shape is the level where we know what the object is. Okay? And that's probably the last level of that goes on. And perhaps there are ways for lower information to directly become directly aware of that without getting awareness of the object. of the object shape. And so this is something that we're working on because we've been studying a young woman. I didn't have time to report, but I'm happy to share the paper with you if you have a week time to read. It's a very long paper, unfortunately. No, I mean, it's only about, I don't know, 130 words, 30 pages, I don't know, 40, I don't know, 50, I don't know. Something, it's pretty long, but it shows some amazing, we were able to identify some internal aspects that associate some kinds of information. But neglect is a great paradigm to do this. And it can help us answer deep questions, but it requires patience, no pun intended there. It requires patience and yeah. So yeah, ask your clinical friends here who have access to patients to do that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, thank you, Alfonso.
And thank you for listening.
And thank you very much for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you.